It was a little after 7:00 a.m. on a Thursday when I heard the knock. 3 sharp raps on the door, spaced too perfectly to be casual. I had just poured myself a cup of black coffee, still wearing my faded Marine Corps sweatshirt, the one with the sleeves fraying and the emblem barely visible after years of washes. I liked the early mornings, the silence, the slow breath of the neighborhood before the chaos of suburban life took over. But this knock was off rhythm. It wasn't the neighbor's kid selling chocolate bars. It wasn't the mailman. It was the kind of knock that made something ancient inside me go stiff, like the instincts that once helped me survive deployments across oceans and deserts. I walked to the front door and peered through the peephole. A man stood on my porch, arms crossed, posture stiff like someone trying too hard to look official. He wore a black tactical vest with HOA enforcement stitched across the front in bold white letters, the kind you could order from a surplus site or embroider yourself if you had the budget and the nerve. He wasn't smiling. I opened the door, but just a crack. "Can I help you?" I asked, keeping my voice even. The man squared his shoulders. "Mr. William R. Carter." "That's me. I'm here on behalf of the Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association. You've been found in violation of several community standards and are hereby notified that you must vacate the property within 48 hours. He extended a folded piece of paper toward me like it was a sacred writ. I didn't reach for it. "Excuse me," I said. "Vacate." His voice grew firmer, like he was used to people not questioning him. Per Article 7 of the Community Compliance Code, you've accumulated multiple infractions, including unauthorized fence maintenance, unregistered outbuilding use, and failure to comply with visual landscaping standards. I raised an eyebrow. The fence he mentioned was the same one I'd repaired with my own hands last month, after a windstorm knocked down 2 panels. The so-called outbuilding was my barn, a structure that had stood on this property longer than the HOA itself. As for landscaping, well, I kept my lawn a little wild. Native plants, good for bees. No one had said a word until now. I opened the door wider, stepping out onto the porch. "Where's your badge?" I asked. He blinked, caught off guard. "Excuse me, you're evicting someone." "You're dressed like law enforcement. Where's your badge?" "I don't need a badge," he said. "I'm acting under the authority of the Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association." I chuckled. Not because it was funny, but because it was absurd. This guy, maybe 40, maybe younger, had all the bravado of a third-rate mall cop trying to play sheriff. And he picked the wrong porch. "You should know," I said, "I'm familiar with the law. In fact, I enforce it." His eyes narrowed. "So what, you're some kind of retired cop?" "Something like that." He thrust the paper toward me again. I took it this time more out of curiosity than concern. The notice looked official at first glance, bold header, HOA logo, block paragraphs, but the formatting was sloppy, and the signature at the bottom was typed, "Not signed." It even misspelled my last name as Cater. "You have 48 hours to vacate," he repeated. "If you refuse, we'll proceed with forcible removal under community authority." I let that statement hang in the air. Forcible removal. "You've made your point," I said, folding the paper neatly. "Now get off my property." He didn't move. I took a step forward. "Now." There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, just enough to show he wasn't ready for pushback. Then, reluctantly, he turned on his heel and marched off the porch. I watched him all the way to his black SUV parked at the curb. It didn't have government plates, just a regular registration with tinted windows and a magnetic HOA decal slapped onto the side. I closed the door and locked it. My coffee had gone cold. I spent the next 10 minutes scanning the document he'd handed me, looking for any legal traction it might have. There was none. It was dressed up in legalese but hollow beneath the surface. No court seal, no police endorsement, no real teeth, just scare tactics, but scare tactics can still hurt people. I thought of my neighbors, retired couples, young families, people who might not have my background or patience, people who might panic when a guy in a vest comes knocking with a phony eviction threat. And that was when it hit me. This wasn't just personal. This was systemic. I went to my office, opened my old military footlocker, and pulled out a small leather case with my credentials. My name, William R. Carter, still engraved on the gold badge inside. County Judge Precinct 4. I hadn't worn it publicly in over a year since stepping back from full-time duties, but the title hadn't changed. Neither had my authority. I didn't need to confront him yet. What I needed was information. Who was this guy? Where did he get that vest? And who in the HOA gave him permission to act like a lawman? That evening, I walked through Evergreen Hills, like I usually did. Friendly nods, quiet waves. But I noticed something I hadn't before, a pattern. 4 houses on Oak Ridge Drive had the same yellow citation slips posted on their mailboxes. 2 more on Juniper Lane, all within the past week. Was this guy making rounds? I passed by one house, where Mark and Sarah Nguyen stood in their driveway, squinting at a document. I stopped. "Excuse me," I said. "Did someone come by today?" Mark nodded. "Yeah, HOA enforcement. Said we need to remove our garden beds or face a fine." Did he look like military surplus? Sarah laughed nervously. "Yeah, kind of. What's going on?" "Don't worry," I said. "Just document everything. Take photos. Keep the papers." They looked confused but nodded. I walked on. When I got home, I poured myself a fresh cup of coffee, hot this time, and sat at the kitchen table. I pulled out a yellow legal pad and started writing. Names, dates, locations, actions. The way I used to build a case when I was fresh out of law school, trying to prove myself in courtrooms twice my size. By midnight, I had 3 full pages and a plan. The next morning, I woke up earlier than usual. Sleep hadn't come easy, and when it did, it was fractured by flashes of that man's smug face and the words, "forcible removal." I sat on the edge of the bed, letting the morning light filter through the blinds. The house was quiet, peaceful, the way I designed it, after a lifetime of chaos in courtrooms, hearings, and late-night motions. But now that calm was under threat. Not from some hardened criminal or violent felon, but from a self-important bully in a vest. By 6:30 a.m., I was already dressed. Not in my usual worn sweatshirt or flannel, but in a pressed collared shirt and jeans that didn't have paint stains on the thighs. I wanted to look casual, but capable. Like someone who could flip a switch from neighborly to formidable if pushed. Because I had a feeling I would be. I set up one of the motion cameras on my porch, discreetly positioned under the eave where no one would see it. Then I tucked a small body cam into the front pocket of my shirt, just in case he returned. And sure enough, at 7:42 a.m. he did. Same man, same SUV, same smug posture. He stepped out of the vehicle, sunglasses already on, despite the cloudy sky, and strode up to my porch like he owned the entire subdivision. His vest looked even more ridiculous in the daylight, a mishmash of patches and Velcro straps like someone had raided a Halloween store with a badge fetish. He knocked 3 times, exactly the same rhythm as before, like a bad actor sticking to his cues. I let him knock again, then opened the door. "Mr. Carter," he said, lips tight. I didn't answer. I just let the silence sit between us. People always rush to fill silence. It makes them uncomfortable. But not me. He shifted. "I'm here to inform you that your refusal to vacate the property places you in direct violation of Compliance Order 11C. That's grounds for HOA-sponsored removal as outlined in the revised neighborhood charter." I tilted my head. Which section of the charter was revised? And when he blinked. "Excuse me, you said it was revised." "I've been a resident here since the founding documents were issued. I don't remember receiving notice of any amendments. It's an internal matter," he said, "only relevant to enforcement staff." I laughed. Not loud, but with enough bite that he knew it wasn't about humor. "You don't know who I am, do you?" He raised his chin. "You're William R. Carter, longtime resident, persistent violator, fence issue, landscaping non-compliance, outbuilding misuse, failure to attend 3 HOA meetings. You got all that memorized, or is it printed on your clipboard?" He looked down. "Damn, it was printed. I'm a county judge," I said plainly. "I've overseen trials more complex than anything in your little playbook. And I've signed off on more actual eviction orders than you've probably read. So if you want to talk about legality, You came to the wrong doorstep wearing the wrong costume. The words landed like a slap. For a second, he wavered. Then he hardened his tone. You're still a resident here. That means you're under HOA jurisdiction. No, I said, stepping out onto the porch. I'm under the jurisdiction of actual law, not cosplay commandos who hand out fake citations and threaten citizens with imaginary codes. His jaw clenched. We'll see what the board says about this. I hope they say something useful in court. He turned storming down the steps, but he made a mistake. He said over his shoulder, "You've got 48 hours. After that, we'll be back with enforcement." And that was the final line he shouldn't have crossed, because he just implied physical action, enforcement, and that in any legal setting is a trigger word. That afternoon, I sat down at my desk and typed out an incident memo addressed to the sheriff's department. I attached the footage from the porch camera audio from my body cam and digital copies of the fraudulent eviction notice. I didn't name drop my position. I didn't have to. The materials spoke for themselves. Then I forwarded a copy to a colleague of mine, District Attorney Antonio Moreno, an old friend from law school who still called me Billy when we got drinks. The subject line I used was simple potential case, impersonation threat, HOA fraud. Within 20 minutes, he replied, "Is this for real?" Dead serious, I responded. This guy needs a warrant. Instead, he's got embroidery and delusions. Antonio Moreno said he'd loop in the local PD's fraud division. I trusted him. But I wasn't done. That evening, I walked to the community bulletin board near the mailbox pavilion. Tacked to the corkboard were all the usual HOA notices. Reminders about lawn height limits, upcoming assessments, the next HOA meeting. At the bottom was a laminated flyer titled, "Know Your Enforcement Officer." And there he was, Brian Talbot, pictured in full uniform, vest, glasses, fake badge, and a smirk like he'd just won a game of poker. Certified HOA Enforcement Liaison, it said underneath. There's no such thing. No state-issued certification. No license, no law enforcement connection. I took a photo. Then I carefully peeled it off the board and walked away. Later, I ran his name through some old court archives. Nothing serious came up, just minor misdemeanors. A resisting arrest charge that had been dropped. A citation for impersonating a park ranger, oddly enough. But nothing that stuck. Nothing that barred him from dressing up again. Which made me wonder, how many people had he pulled this act on before that night I decided to take a walk around Evergreen Hills? The houses on Alder Creek all looked the same neutral tones. Two-car garages, polite garden gnomes, and all that suburban conformity. But when I passed Lot 37, I noticed Mrs. Evelyn Harper standing on her porch holding a red notice in her trembling hands. "Evening, ma'am," I said gently. She looked up. "Oh, good evening. Everything all right?" She glanced down at the paper. "It's from the HOA. Says I've been leaving my trash bins out too long. They're threatening fines. I live alone, and I can't always bring them in the same day." "Did someone come to deliver it?" "Yes, a man in uniform. Said I was on a warning list." I bit the inside of my cheek. "Did he say his name? Brian, I think." "Very rude." I nodded. "Would you mind if I take a photo of the notice?" She hesitated. "Will it get me in trouble?" "No, ma'am," I said. "It might just help get someone else out of trouble." She handed it over. I snapped a clear photo and handed it back with a soft smile. Then I walked on this time, with a bit more purpose in my step. Because now I wasn't just protecting myself, I was protecting my neighbors too. The next 2 days passed with a strange kind of tension in the air, the kind I hadn't felt since my early days on the bench. It was that low hum of anticipation, before something breaks, not in a courtroom, but in a neighborhood. Evergreen Hills wasn't used to disruption. It was the kind of place where people waved when they passed, even if they didn't know your name. Where kids rode their scooters in tight little herds and retirees gardened in wide-brimmed hats. But now, with HOA citations piling up like junk mail and a man in a vest pretending to wield authority, the entire community had started to feel watched. On Saturday morning, right after the church bells chimed 9, Brian Talbot returned. I watched him from the window. He parked his SUV at the corner, same angle, as before, windows rolled down like he expected applause for his arrival. There were 2 other people with him this time, both in matching vests. One male, one female, both trying far too hard to look menacing. I grabbed my phone, started recording. They split up clipboard in hand, walking in opposite directions, like they were covering territory. Brian, of course, headed straight for my door. I opened it before he could knock. "Mr. Carter," he said with that same sour twist of a smile. "You've failed to comply. That puts you in breach of charter directives. We're escalating the matter." "Escalating," I repeated. "Is that the term you're using?" "Yes," he said, as if practicing for a camera. "As per subsection 14A. I'm authorized to initiate the next phase of correctional response. That includes property lockout and enforced removal if necessary." Let me stop you right there. I stepped out onto the porch, phone still recording from my hand, deliberately in view. "You're on my property. You've made legal threats. You've implied you will forcefully remove me from my home. That's unlawful. And more importantly, it's stupid." His mouth opened, but I raised a finger. "Let me finish. You're impersonating a law enforcement officer. You're issuing documents that have no legal authority. You're using coercive language in a residential community with minors, elderly, and veterans present. And you're doing all this under the delusion that a homeowners association can override the U.S. Constitution." I paused to let it sink in. "I've submitted evidence to the Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office. Your face, your voice, your nonsense paperwork recorded, cataloged, and flagged for criminal review. You've walked into a courtroom you don't understand, and you don't even know you're the defendant." His eyes darted to the phone. "You can't record me without consent. I can on my own property. I can also call 911 and report a trespassing threat in progress, which is what you are right now." For a moment, I thought he might crack. The facade flickered just enough to show fear underneath, but then he puffed up again. "You think your fancy words matter? You think being a lawyer makes you special?" I smiled, stepping 1 foot closer. "I'm not a lawyer. I'm your judge." He actually took a step back. "I preside over County Court, Precinct 4. That means I've sentenced more serious offenders than you could name. I know the law. I know the loopholes, and I know exactly how to take a fraud like you apart motion by motion, hearing by hearing." He didn't speak. He couldn't. I turned the phone off for now. "You've got 2 choices," I said. "You walk off this porch, tear up your fake citations, and never return. Or you keep playing cowboy until real deputies knock on your door instead of mine." Brian didn't answer. He just stood there twitching slightly like a man caught between bluffing and bolting. Eventually, he turned, muttering something under his breath, and walked back to his car. His 2 deputies, or whatever they were pretending to be, followed, casting nervous glances at each other. I stood on the porch until they were gone. Only then did I let myself breathe. That afternoon, I printed out every citation and notice I could find that had been issued to my neighbors over the past 30 days. I'd quietly asked a few folks on my walk the night before if they'd be willing to share, and they had more than I expected. Fence height violations, decorative item infractions, garden box citations, even Mrs. Evelyn Harper fined for her mailbox paint being too metallic. All of them were signed by Brian Talbot. All of them looked official. None of them were. I built a dossier. Then I drafted a formal complaint under Texas Penal Code or 3711, impersonating a public servant. That's a felony, not a slap-on-the-wrist ordinance, but a charge that comes with jail time and a permanent criminal record. I attached every file, every image, every statement I'd gathered. Then I sent the whole thing to the Sheriff's Department with a copy to DA Antonio Moreno, marking it priority. HOA Fraud Unit. By Monday, the ripple had begun. A quiet patrol car rolled through Evergreen Hills that afternoon, slow and deliberate. It didn't stop, didn't flash lights, but it circled twice as if signaling, "We're watching now." Then came the knock on my door. This time, it wasn't Brian. It was Karen Lafferty, the HOA president. She was in her late 60s, perfectly coiffed, with pastel cardigans for every day of the week, and the coldest smile in the county. "Judge Carter," she said, tone drenched in sugar. "May I come in? I'd rather we speak on the porch." She hesitated, then nodded. Very well. She looked past me into the house like she expected to see courtroom pews and gavels. We've had some misunderstandings, she said. Brian may have overstepped. He was trying to be proactive. Proactive is not impersonating law enforcement. We only wanted to ensure the standards of the neighborhood were upheld. By threatening eviction, fines, removal. Her smile thinned. If you pursue legal action, it will divide the community. No, I said. Brian did that. I'm cleaning it up. She stiffened. You're not just a resident, William. You're an officer of the court. Surely you understand discretion. I met her gaze. I also understand justice. She didn't reply. I let the silence hang between us like a curtain she couldn't lift. Then she nodded tight and slow. You'll be hearing from our counsel. I look forward to it. She left the scent of expensive perfume trailing behind her like the echo of a closing argument. I stood there on the porch long after she was gone, watching the sun dip low over evergreen hills. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. But for the first time in weeks, I felt the ground shifting under my feet, not crumbling, but rising. Because I wasn't the one under threat anymore. I was the one drawing the line. The next few days, I didn't make a single move publicly. No more porch confrontations, no HOA meetings, no pressuring neighbors or grandstanding. I just watched. That's what people like Brian and Karen don't expect. They assume people like me, older, quiet, unassuming, will either cave to pressure or go off like a loose cannon. What they're not prepared for is the stillness that comes before precision. The same kind of stillness I learned long ago, back when I wore desert fatigues and waited in dead silence for a signal half a world away. The enemy always moves when you're patient. On Tuesday morning, I went to the county records office, not to file a case just yet, but to dig. I requested public records, including HOA bylaws, amendments, enforcement authorization forms, and the most important of all, board meeting minutes. Evergreen Hills was supposed to keep minutes on every vote, every policy change, and every compliance initiative. They'd filed most of them correctly over the years, but something stood out. There was no record of any vote to hire or appoint Brian Talbot to any enforcement position. Not even an informal motion. Just a name scribbled onto a bulletin flyer and uploaded to the HOA website without so much as a digital timestamp. His position was fabricated. Worse still, the bylaws stated explicitly that no member or agent of the HOA may impersonate or present themselves as a representative of law enforcement, municipal authority, or government body without appropriate certification or written delegation. It was buried in the back pages, but it was there. I made copies, dozens of them. And just to be thorough, I requested access to HOA expense reports for the past 12 months. The clerk at the records office, Devin Carter, raised an eyebrow. You know, most people come in here about noise complaints or tree trimming permits, right? I smiled. This is tree trimming, just a different kind of branch. He laughed, handed over the printouts, and wished me luck. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with everything spread out in front of me like a general mapping out a battlefield. Legal pads, highlighters, post-it notes, screenshots from neighbor submissions. I was building a case not just for myself, but for every resident who had been bullied into silence. I marked off 5 key angles: impersonation of law enforcement, Texas Penal Code, Tower 37.11. As previously noted, fraudulent representation of authority, leveraging non-existent powers for coercive action, unauthorized access, and threats of eviction, trespassing, intimidation, potential abuse of process, financial misconduct, HOA dues being allocated toward non-authorized enforcement activity, systemic negligence by the HOA board for allowing this theater of power to continue unchecked. Each angle came with evidence, timestamped, verified. Still, I didn't file. Not yet. I wanted Brian and Karen to move first. On Wednesday morning, they did. An envelope appeared in my mailbox. No postage, no return address, just my name typed and taped on the front. Inside was a final notice of non-compliance. It stated that if I did not vacate the property by Friday, The HOA would initiate physical asset reclamation and seize community-managed property rights on my lot. It was comical. Legally meaningless. But it proved intent. I scanned it, uploaded it to the shared folder I had created for DA Antonio Moreno's office, and added a note. They're doubling down. Recommend moving timeline forward. He replied within the hour. Copy. Sheriff's Department looping in their legal advisor. Requesting preliminary affidavit from you by Friday. I nodded to no one and began writing. Meanwhile, Evergreen Hills was starting to talk. Trisha Patel from the block over stopped me during a morning walk. She held a Starbucks cup in one hand and her phone in the other, displaying a video. It was footage of Brian yelling at Noah Kim for having a political flag hanging off their porch. He accused the kid of inciting neighborhood division and threatened to fine the family into compliance. You seen this? She asked. Just now, I said. He said he'd call the cops on my husband for leaving a trailer hitched overnight. Like, what even is that? It's noise in a vest, I told her. But we're almost done listening to it. She blinked. What do you mean? I offered her a gentle smile. Let's just say. He's not the only one taking notes. That evening, I went to the HOA website. I expected it to be sanitized, maybe even shut down. Instead, I found gold. Karen had posted an official statement defending Brian's actions. She called them brave, proactive, and necessary to maintain the values of our community. She claimed the board had given Brian verbal delegation and that he had received training from third-party consultants. She even signed it. What she didn't realize is that by doing so, she had just publicly tied herself to Brian's impersonation and unlawful actions in writing. I took a screenshot, 3 copies. They say criminals incriminate themselves. HOA presidents apparently post their own confessions. Thursday morning, I heard from Devin Carter again. He dug deeper at my casual suggestion into the HOA's reimbursement records. And guess what? Brian had been paid a monthly consulting stipend for 7 months. No contract, no IRS forms, no employment verification. Just Venmo payments labeled Neighborhood Patrol Services. That was it. The final thread. It was no longer just about a man in a vest. It was about an entire HOA board complicit in fraud, illegal spending, and harassment of homeowners. I printed out the receipts. Devin Carter emailed me a notarized summary. The time for observation was over. Tomorrow, I would act. Friday evening arrived with a humid breeze and the kind of nervous energy that clung to the air like static. Evergreen Hills' monthly HOA meeting was scheduled for 6:00 p.m. sharp in the community clubhouse, a 2-story stucco building that tried too hard to look like a civic center, complete with a flagpole, fake brick pillars, and a squeaky wooden podium inside that always leaned slightly to the left. I had only attended 2 HOA meetings in the past 5 years. Both had been exercises in eye-rolling and migraine management. But this time I didn't attend as a passive resident. I wasn't there to listen. I was there to expose. I arrived 15 minutes early, dressed plainly khakis, button-up shirt, no jacket. I carried no briefcase, no folders, just a thumb drive in my front pocket, with every piece of damning evidence I had collected backed up in 3 separate cloud accounts and printed off in sealed envelopes stored safely at home. The room was already filling. Maybe 30 residents, young couples, retirees, even a few teens dragged in by their parents. There was more tension in the air than usual. You could feel it. People weren't just here to complain about fence heights and overgrown hedges. They were here because something had cracked open. At the front of the room stood the usual suspects, Karen Lafferty, in her pastel blue cardigan and pearls, flanked by the rest of the HOA board, 5 members, in total all looking like they'd rather be anywhere else. And then there was Brian Talbot, seated slightly off-center like a guest of honor, wearing his now infamous black vest and looking like a man playing soldier in a community theater production. Karen cleared her throat into the microphone. Good evening, everyone. I'd like to begin by thanking you for your presence and for your continued commitment to the standards that make Evergreen Hills such a special community. The forced cheer in her voice grated like sandpaper. We understand there's been some confusion lately surrounding compliance procedures and enforcement presence. We'd like to take this opportunity to clarify those matters and reaffirm our shared goals. She looked toward Brian with a tight smile. Mr. Talbot has volunteered countless hours to ensure our neighborhood remains safe, visually cohesive, and free of code violations. His role has been misunderstood by some, but we want to make clear his service is appreciated. Several residents shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few crossed their arms. Trisha Patel whispered something to her husband and shook her head. Karen continued. There have been rumors, unfortunate rumors, circulating online and in casual conversations suggesting misconduct or misrepresentation. Let me assure you the board has acted in full compliance with its delegated authority. That was when I stood up. No dramatic gestures, no slamming fists, just a quiet, calm rise. Karen's voice faltered. Mr. Carter, she said, please wait for the open comments section. I believe now would be more appropriate, I replied, stepping into the aisle. Before this meeting continues under false pretenses. The room went still. I'm William R. Carter, I said. Many of you know me simply as your neighbor. What you may not know is that I also serve as a county judge, Precinct 4. And over the past 10 days, I've been quietly documenting what can only be described as a systemic abuse of power by this HOA board and its so-called enforcement agent, Brian Talbot. Brian shifted in his chair. Karen opened her mouth, but I held up a hand. This is not conjecture. This is not rumor. This is a legal matter, and I urge everyone here to listen carefully. I pulled the thumb drive from my pocket and held it up. Contained here are photographic records, recorded interactions, digital communications, public financial data, and official policy contradictions, all of which paint a very clear picture. Brian Talbot has never been legally appointed, authorized, or certified to act as an enforcement officer under this HOA. He has issued unlawful notices, made threats of eviction, impersonated law enforcement, and accepted unregulated payments from HOA funds without board authorization, employment records, or IRS documentation. The silence was volcanic. Furthermore, I have documented statements from residents who were intimidated, fined without due process, and in some cases, threatened with physical removal from their own homes. Karen's mouth opened again. Mr. Carter. This is not your podium anymore, Mrs. Lafferty. Gasps rippled through the room. I've submitted everything to the Sheriff's Department and the District Attorney's Office. Investigations are underway. This meeting is being recorded both by me and I'm told by others in this room. Indeed, I could now see 3 phones quietly pointed in my direction. Any attempt to misrepresent the situation further will be considered obstruction. Brian stood suddenly. You think you can scare me because you wear a robe in court? I turned to face him. No, Brian, I don't need to scare you. The law will do that just fine, he sneered. I was just doing what I was told. And who told you to impersonate a peace officer, to find elderly women over trash bins, to harass teenagers about flags? He didn't answer. Karen finally lost her composure. This is an ambush, an abuse of authority. We were trying to protect the community by intimidating it, I asked. She glared at me. You're just a man with an opinion. No, I said. I'm a man with evidence. And you're a board with a problem. The meeting dissolved after that, people shouting, others demanding explanations. Someone cried in the back row. A couple of board members tried to sneak out the side door, but residents followed them. No one was leaving without answers. I stayed calm, collected, focused. Brian stormed out, pushing past 2 retirees without apology. Karen followed, still muttering that this was all a misunderstanding. But her voice no longer carried any weight. The clubhouse emptied slowly, residents huddling in groups, asking each other questions. Some came up to me, shaking my hand, thanking me. Others just nodded silently, that look of quiet relief on their faces, like someone had finally pulled the curtain back. Later that night, as I sat on my porch with the crickets chirping and the stars just beginning to cut through the haze, I received a text from DA Antonio Moreno. Sheriff's Office drafting warrant for Talbot. Possible charges: impersonation, harassment, misuse of funds. Will update in the morning. I stared at the message for a long moment. Then I typed 2 words. About time. The morning after the meeting felt different. The air itself had changed, as if the entire neighborhood had exhaled something it didn't even know it was holding in. For the first time in weeks, no SUV circled the block. No black vest appeared outside mailboxes. No one snapped photos of lawn ornaments or stoops. Instead, there was a kind of cautious stillness, like the moments after a storm when you're not sure if it's truly past or just pausing. Around 10:00 a.m., I received a phone call from Deputy Maria Ruiz. A calm, precise voice I knew from the courthouse circuit. "Judge Carter, yes, Brian Talbot has been taken into custody. No incident. Cooperative, but annoyed." That sounds about right. We served the warrant at his place this morning. Found additional fabricated documents, a storage box full of fake citations, and several badges, all self-made. Badges, I asked. Multiple. He had patches for HOA Enforcement Neighborhood Patrol, and even a laminated ID card labeled Municipal Code Officer with a fake seal. I closed my eyes for a beat. Anyone else with him alone? He lives in a rented townhouse. No weapons found. But he did have a body cam of his own, which we've secured. Should help clarify the level of intimidation he employed. I nodded, even though she couldn't see me. "Thank you, Deputy. We'll keep you updated." The arrest wasn't made public yet, but word spread fast in communities like ours. By lunchtime, neighbors were walking their dogs a little longer than usual, pausing near one another to ask, "Did you hear, or is it true? I didn't confirm anything." Not then. Let the silence do its work. For now. Instead, I went back to the documents. Now that Brian had been removed, the focus needed to shift because, in truth, Brian had never been the real architect. He was a pawn. A dangerous, arrogant pawn, but a pawn nonetheless. The person I was more interested in was Karen Lafferty. While Brian was out there swinging his clipboard like a sword, Karen had been the one holding the scabbard. I returned to my records folder and reopened the HOA financials. With Brian arrested, I expected the board to quietly remove any trace of him from the official website. But when I logged in, something else caught my eye, a fresh update. A special board statement uploaded just hours after the meeting. The Evergreen Hills Homeowners Association Board regrets recent events and has chosen to suspend all external enforcement actions until further notice. The board will conduct an internal review of past protocols and address any community concerns at the next meeting. No signature, no names, just a generic post. But I had already anticipated this tactic, the classic maneuver of self-preservation through vague accountability, and I was ready to hit harder. That afternoon, I visited the county records office and requested a complete history of board appointments for Evergreen Hills. As I suspected, Karen had exceeded her legal term by 11 months. She had quietly extended her presidency by emergency vote during the pandemic, a loophole that was supposed to be ratified the following year. It never was. Worse, she had signed off on nearly $14,000 in payments to community security consultants, a line item that was never described in detail. But the dates matched the same period Brian had been active. And there it was, her name. Karen Lafferty, authorizing officer on every one of those payments. By evening, I had written a formal petition for Karen's removal, backed by neighborhood signatures, 18 in total, and framed under HOA bylaws stating that any officer acting in a manner detrimental to the harmony, legality, or fiduciary responsibility of the community could be subject to an emergency vote of dismissal. I made copies, printed packets, and dropped them off at 12 homes, trusted neighbors who I knew had been targeted, harassed, or silenced over the years. I didn't ask them to believe me. I asked them to read. One of the packets ended up in the hands of Jerome Adams, a retired postal inspector with a memory like a vault. He knocked on my door that night. I looked at the dates, he said. I remember seeing Brian in the neighborhood long before the board ever mentioned enforcement. Makes you wonder. Makes you angry, I corrected. He smiled. I've got the HOA contact list from last year. Still have access to the member emails. Want to write a letter I already did. Together we formatted. It added Jerome's signature as a witness and scheduled it to send to every verified resident email at 9:20 a.m. the next morning. The next day, the message went out. Subject line, the truth behind your HOA. The body included a summary of the arrest, the documented impersonation, financial mismanagement, and Karen's unauthorized tenure. Attached were links to public filings, complaint records, and relevant codes written in plain English so no one could misinterpret them. The response was swift. By noon, I had 12 new emails from residents who had previously stayed silent, thanking me. Some shared stories of being fined for potted plants for wind chimes, for letting their kid leave a skateboard near the walkway. All of them had felt powerless, until now. By sunset, Karen sent a mass message from her personal Gmail. Dear residents, I want to personally address the sudden flood of misinformation that has recently circulated. It saddens me that our community's shared values are being eroded by personal vendettas. I have always acted in what I believed was our best interest. I didn't even finish reading it, because I knew the panic when I saw it. She was scrambling. At 7:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. I opened it to find Karen herself visibly tired. Makeup faded, her cardigan wrinkled like she'd slept in it. Judge Carter, she said, may I speak with you? This is your second time asking that, I replied. What's different now? She swallowed. I want to avoid further damage. I want to resign. I studied her face. It wasn't just fear of prosecution. It was loss of control. For the first time in years, she was no longer the unquestioned voice behind every rule and restriction. The crown had slipped, and she'd rather hand it off quietly than have it torn away. I'll accept your resignation, I said, in writing, copied to the board, copied to residents. I'll send it tonight. You'll also refund any dues misallocated under your authorization. I've already drafted a restitution plan. Her eyes widened, but she nodded. And Karen, I added before she turned, you're lucky. This is still just civil. She left without another word. Later that evening, a new message appeared on the HOA website. Karen Lafferty has formally resigned as HOA president. A special election will be held next week. All enforcement activities remain suspended. Community input is encouraged. No dramatics, no spin, just the facts. It was over. At least the worst of it. By the time Sunday rolled around, Evergreen Hills had taken on a strange new rhythm. The air was lighter. The sidewalks felt wider, and for once people weren't avoiding eye contact. They were nodding, waving, even stopping to chat. A few thanked me as I walked past. Lila Patel brought me a small Tupperware of banana bread, said she didn't know what else to do to show her gratitude. I told her the gesture was more than enough. It meant everything. But inside, I didn't feel triumphant. Not really. I felt watchful. Because people like Karen and Brian don't operate alone. They draw power from silence, from systems that don't question them, from communities too polite or too tired to push back. Taking out two pieces doesn't mean the board game ends. It just reshuffles the pieces. So I kept my guard up. On Monday morning, I met with Deputy Maria Ruiz and DA Antonio Moreno at the county building. We sat in a small glass conference room overlooking the courthouse lawn, neutral territory. We've completed the search of Talbot's residence, Deputy Maria Ruiz said. Found printed maps of the neighborhood marked with red X's. They line up with citations he issued. Targets, I said. Exactly. Also found several files labeled Priority Enforcement, including photographs of you, Judge Carter. That gave me pause. I hadn't expected to find myself in the middle of one of his manila folders, but I wasn't surprised either. Was he planning something, I asked? DA Antonio Moreno shook his head. Nothing that points to physical intent. No weapons, no manifesto. Just delusions of authority and a disturbing amount of self-importance. I nodded slowly. So what's next? He's facing 4 charges, DA Antonio Moreno replied. Impersonating a public servant, criminal trespass, harassment, and fraudulent documentation. Will probably offer a plea if he cooperates. Community service probation, permanent HOA ban. I don't care if he gets 10 years or 10 weeks, I said. What matters is that people know the truth, they will, Deputy Maria Ruiz said, and they'll remember who gave them the courage to say something. I let that sit in the silence. Back at home, I reviewed my notes on the remaining board members. Karen was gone, but there were still others who had sat by and said nothing. Who had approved budgets, ignored complaints, and allowed Brian to operate unchecked. One in particular stood out: Gary Mullins, the treasurer. He'd been quiet during the meeting from hell, avoiding eye contact and tapping his pen like it was Morse code. He hadn't made a public statement since the arrest, but his name had appeared on several payment approvals to Brian and the Phantom Community Security Consultant account. I gave him a call. "Gary," I said after he picked up, "this is William R. Carter. We need to talk." He sounded nervous. I don't know if I should. The rest of the board, what's left of it, asked us to lay low." "You're the treasurer, right?" "Yes." "Then you have a legal responsibility, and possibly a chance to clear your name." He was quiet for a moment, then said, "Can we meet in person?" We met at the back table of Della's Cafe, a small diner just off Main Street, where no one bothered you if you sat with coffee and didn't touch the toast. Gary looked 10 years older than his 63 years, bags under his eyes. Shaking hands, a man unraveling under the weight of decisions he didn't fully understand. "I didn't know how deep it went," he said, after I pressed record with his consent. "Karen said Brian was a contractor, said it would save us money on legal fees, said we'd be covered if we just let him handle it. Did you sign anything?" He nodded. "Vouchers, reimbursement forms." But she filled most of them out ahead of time. Said it was all standard. Did the rest of the board see the transactions? No one looked closely. We trusted her. And what about when residents started complaining? She said people always complain. Said if we stayed strong, they'd fall in line. That's how HOA works, right? "No," I said gently. "That's how control works, not community." He slumped in his seat. I reached into my folder and slid a copy of the restitution plan across the table. "You can still make this right. You and the remaining board members. Sign on to the plan. Help redistribute improperly used funds. Assist in holding a fair election." He stared at it. "Would that keep me out of trouble?" "I'm not your judge in this case," I said. "But it would show good faith. The kind juries and neighbors remember." He nodded slowly. By Thursday, Gary had signed. So had 2 other board members. They agreed to cooperate with the investigation, endorse a community-led restructuring plan, and assist in dissolving any remaining contracts tied to Brian's enforcement activity. Word spread quickly. HOA members scheduled a special election. Ballots were printed. Residents lined up at the clubhouse not to complain or be intimidated, but to vote. Some of them brought lawn chairs. Others brought lemonade. It felt more like a block party than a referendum. And that was the point. We weren't just removing the old guard. We were reclaiming the ground beneath our feet. I didn't run for a board seat. I didn't want power. I wanted peace. But I agreed to be part of the oversight committee, unpaid, neutral, and fully transparent. I showed up to meetings with no gavel, no robe, no courtroom formality. Just a pen, a notebook, and a memory that didn't forget what silence cost us. And slowly things began to shift. The fines stopped. The threats ended. The lawns grew a little taller, a little freer. People left bikes on sidewalks and chalk drawings on driveways. No one came to erase them. One night, weeks later, I stood on my porch again, coffee in hand, the stars overhead. It had rained earlier, and the pavement still shimmered in the glow of streetlights. I watched as Ethan and Lucas Chen biked past, laughing unafraid. And behind them, James and Emily Brooks walking hand in hand. No citations in their mailbox, no threats on their door. Just life, just community. Not ruled, but shared. The following Monday was different. Not in the soft, subtle way that things had begun to shift the past few weeks, but in a definitive, public, and permanent sort of way. This was the day the people of Evergreen Hills would see justice not as a concept whispered on porches or mumbled over coffee, but as something that could stand in the daylight, look you in the eye, and say, "I'm here now. I haven't forgotten." At exactly 9:00 a.m., Brian Talbot was formally arraigned at the county courthouse. The courtroom was full, standing room only. Residents from Evergreen Hills packed the wooden benches like spectators at a long-awaited play, only this wasn't theater. This was accountability, real and visible. Brian shuffled in, his shoulders hunched, but still somehow trying to convey defiance. Gone were the vest and sunglasses. He wore a cheap suit now, one that didn't quite fit, too loose in the sleeves, too tight in the gut. A public defender walked beside him, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. The judge presiding wasn't me that would have been a conflict of interest. Instead, it was Judge Marilyn Clay, a colleague I respected deeply. She was known for her calm firmness and complete intolerance for arrogance. The charges were read aloud: impersonation of a public servant, criminal trespass, harassment, forgery of government documents. Brian's eyes flicked toward the crowd as each charge was announced. He spotted me sitting in the back row, stone still. He looked away quickly. Judge Marilyn Clay didn't allow dramatics. She simply asked for a plea. Brian pled no contest, a quiet surrender that carried no apology but admitted defeat. The room didn't erupt. No one clapped. There were no cheers, only the quiet rustling of people sitting straighter in their seats. Like a collective exhale, a communal acknowledgement that a chapter had closed. Afterward, DA Antonio Moreno met me outside the courthouse. He leaned against a concrete planter and pulled off his sunglasses. Clean resolution, he said. Plea deal includes restitution, community service, and a permanent injunction against any future HOA employment enforcement or affiliation anywhere in the state. He deserves it, I replied. And more. He got lucky. If you hadn't documented everything the way you did, we might have had to settle with a warning. I shook my head. If it weren't me, it would have happened to someone else, someone less equipped to fight back. He nodded solemnly. And that's the part that keeps me up at night. Back in Evergreen Hills, word spread fast. An email from the HOA Oversight Committee, of which I was now quietly part, summarized the outcome with deliberate clarity. The individual known as Brian Talbot, previously presented as an HOA enforcement agent, has pled no contest to criminal charges associated with impersonation and harassment. The HOA board affirms that no such enforcement authority was legally granted, and no future private enforcement roles will be permitted. The email ended with a simple line: "This community belongs to its people, not to fear." The rest of that week unfolded like a season change. People repainted fences without asking for permission. Noah Kim put up a small mural on the side of their shed flowers and words like resilience and home. No one removed it. A few folks set up lawn chairs in their driveways, again music drifting into the street with the smell of barbecue. The unspoken tension that had hung over Evergreen Hills like low fog had lifted. And as for Karen Lafferty, she sold her home. Within 2 weeks of Brian's arraignment, a moving truck appeared in her driveway. No farewell notes, no goodbyes. She left at dawn on a Thursday silently, like someone retreating from a lost war. The home was later purchased by James and Emily Brooks, with a toddler and a dog who barked too much but made everyone laugh. I introduced myself on their second day. They'd heard nothing about the drama that had unfolded, just that the house was available, the street was quiet, and the neighbors seemed kind. That was enough. A week later, the new HOA board was sworn in. Elected by the residents. Fully transparent. Rotating seats, limited terms, public budget reviews. They asked me to preside over the ceremony, not as a judge, but as a neighbor. I stood at the podium, the same one that had once been used to justify fines, threats, and shame. I looked out over the room, filled with people who had once been afraid to speak, and I said, "We're not here to build walls. We're here to build trust. Let's never forget the difference." A month passed. Then 2. Seasons shifted. Lawns changed with the weather. Trees dropped their leaves in amber spirals. Brian faded into a distant memory. Karen's name rarely came up, and when it did, it was only in hushed tones, the way you talk about a cautionary tale. But something more important remained. People had changed. They smiled more, checked in on each other, created a neighborhood watch that didn't patrol but simply walked together, laughing, talking, waving at homes with porch lights on. It wasn't perfection. It was better. One crisp fall afternoon, I sat at my kitchen table writing a letter. It wasn't official. It wasn't for the court. It was a personal note to myself meant for a day in the future when I might doubt whether all of this had mattered. It read, "You didn't win by yelling. You didn't win by force. You won by standing still when it mattered most. You reminded people that silence can be broken and that law, when held with compassion, can heal more than punish. You didn't fix everything. But you changed something, and sometimes that's enough." I folded it, placed it in an envelope, and tucked it into the back of my bookshelf. Maybe one day I'd forget. Maybe one day someone else would find it and remember. But for now, Evergreen Hills had found its voice, and mine was no longer needed to defend it. I thought things would quiet down after the trial, after the resignation, after the board turnover. But justice, it turns out, doesn't end when the gavel falls. It echoes. It stirs up dust from corners people forgot existed. And in Evergreen Hills, there was plenty of dust. The first ripple came from the outside. Local news caught wind of the story. A quiet segment aired late one Thursday night on Channel 4's Investigative Reports. The headline read, "Fake HOA Cop Arrested After Judge Neighbor Uncovers Scheme." The story included clips from the courtroom interviews with residents and even a blurred photo of Brian standing in front of a mailbox with his infamous vest on. They called it the quiet revolution in a sleepy neighborhood. I cringed at the term revolution. It made things sound louder than they were. This wasn't a revolution. It was a correction, a course reset, the fixing of a compass needle that had spun off true north for too long. The next day, the segment went viral. Neighboring communities began reaching out. I received a dozen emails in a single morning from people in surrounding counties. "How did you do it? Our HOA is doing the same thing. Can we talk to someone on your new board? Do you have copies of your new policies?" It dawned on me, this wasn't just a story about Evergreen Hills. It was a story about what was possible when anyone chose to stop being quiet. Back at home, I watched our neighborhood transform in small, permanent ways. The clubhouse, once a place of whispered warnings and rulebooks, had become a true community space again. The board installed a lending library near the front steps. Someone organized a monthly porch concert series where local kids played guitar or violin, while neighbors brought lawn chairs and thermoses of hot cider. We created an annual event called the Day of the Reset, a tongue-in-cheek tribute to the day Brian was arrested. It started as a joke, but it caught on. That first year, we hosted a community breakfast in the park. Tables were lined with homemade biscuits, scrambled eggs, and pancakes. People brought their dogs. Ethan and Lucas Chen played tag. Someone printed shirts that said "No More Vests." And there, standing beside me, was Jerome Adams, former postal inspector, now co-chair of the Neighborhood Watch, grinning like a man who'd seen the whole arc of the storm. "You know what the best part is," he said, sipping his coffee. "What's that?" No one's afraid anymore. Still, there were things to fix. The financial audit we initiated uncovered nearly $22,000 in improperly allocated HOA funds from the previous 3 years. The board voted unanimously to suspend all discretionary spending until the matter was resolved. Karen's restitution plan, agreed to during her resignation, covered a portion of it. Brian, now on probation, was legally required to repay a modest amount through community service credits, but most of the balance would be absorbed by structural changes. We cut unnecessary landscaping contracts, renegotiated garbage collection fees, and restructured HOA dues for more transparency. Residents had the right to see every dollar spent online, real-time updated monthly. That single change did more to rebuild trust than any speech ever could. The cleanup wasn't just procedural, it was emotional. I had neighbors stop by just to talk, not about bylaws or budgets, but about how it felt to live in a place where your garden used to be a liability, where the height of your mailbox could be a reason for a knock on the door. Mark Nguyen. A recent widower told me he used to worry every week that someone would file a complaint about his overgrown roses. They'd been his wife's. "I didn't want to cut them," he said, voice cracking. "They're the only thing left of her out here." I told him the roses could grow as wild as they wanted. They did. As the months passed, I stepped back. The new board didn't need me. They had found their rhythm. My oversight role became mostly symbolic, a reminder of how things had gone wrong and how they'd been made right. I spent more time at home, in the garden, reading. Taking long walks through the neighborhood I had once feared would turn against itself. And then one day, I received a letter. It was from the Texas State Judicial Ethics Committee. They had reviewed the public nature of the case and my role in it. They commended the restraint I had shown. There would be no investigation, no reprimand. At the bottom of the page, handwritten in blue ink, were 6 words from the committee chair. "You honored the robe without wearing it." I folded the letter and tucked it beside the one I had written to myself months earlier. On the anniversary of Brian's arrest, I stood in my driveway and watched Ethan and Lucas Chen draw chalk murals on the pavement. One wrote, "Our neighborhood equals our rules" in big blocky letters. Another drew a dog with a superhero cape labeled Captain Bark HOA Watchdog. It was all lighthearted. It was all honest. Their laughter echoed down the street, and in that sound, I heard something I hadn't heard in a long time. Not relief, not resistance, freedom. That night, Jerome and I sat out on the porch. He brought whiskey, I brought stories. We didn't talk about Karen or Brian or even the board. We talked about how fragile trust is, how easily it slips away, how much work it takes to get it back, and how damn worth it is when you finally do. Fall gave way to winter in slow, golden motion. The trees in evergreen hills let go of their leaves one stubborn branch at a time, as if unwilling to surrender all at once. I understood that feeling. After everything we'd been through, the neighborhood, like me, had become cautious about releasing too much too quickly. Healing doesn't arrive in a single day. It unfolds like sunrise. Gradual. Earned. In the months following Brian's sentencing and Karen's departure, life in the neighborhood had settled into a rhythm I once thought impossible. It wasn't perfection, but it was finally peaceful. The new board operated with the efficiency of a good kitchen, transparent, reliable, and without pretense. HOA meetings were now live-streamed. Votes were recorded, explained, and archived online. Residents who once stayed silent now came forward with suggestions, not complaints. More than once, people asked if I'd run for board president. I declined every time. I didn't fight for power, I told them. I fought for balance. Besides, I'd already had a lifetime of gavels and oaths. What I wanted now was simple: to sit on my porch, drink coffee, and know that my neighbors were living freely, unwatched, unthreatened, unafraid. One morning in early January, I stepped outside just before sunrise. The air was cold enough to sting a little, but I liked that. It reminded me I was still here, still breathing, still part of the quiet that had returned to the street. I cradled my mug, coffee brewed just the way I liked it, dark and honest, and leaned against the porch post. Across the street, Ethan and Lucas Chen were building a snow fort out of what little snow had fallen overnight. Their laughter came in bursts, mixing with the sound of their dog barking at every snowball launched. A few doors down, Lila Patel opened her garage, unplugged her hybrid, and waved at me as she backed out. She was new here, didn't know the whole story, but she smiled every morning like we'd known each other for years. That's how it should be. No one should have to inherit the trauma of a neighborhood just to find belonging. Sometime mid-morning, I received an envelope in the mail. No return address, just my name handwritten in block letters. Inside was a note, short and to the point. "You were right. I went too far." I thought I was protecting something, but I was just afraid of losing control. "I hope you find peace. I hope I can too." Okay, I read it once, then again. There was no apology, not really. No offer of restitution or redemption. Just a whisper of regret. A recognition of what had been done. And honestly, that was enough. I folded it, set it aside, and didn't reply. Because peace doesn't always need closure. Sometimes it just needs stillness. Later that day, I met Jerome at the new community garden. It had been built where the old HOA Compliance Center used to be, a small office Karen once used to print warnings and store binders full of rules. Now the space was full of planter beds, rain barrels, and hand-painted signs that read things like "Grow together" and "Water what matters." Jerome handed me a trowel. "You're not retired yet," he joked. I knelt beside him, scooping fresh soil into an empty bed. "What are we planting?" I asked. He smiled. "Lavender, supposed to attract the right kind of bees." I nodded. "We could use more of those." We worked in silence for a while, the kind of silence that feels like a song only you can hear. Every now and then, a neighbor stopped by. Some brought seeds. Others just came to look. A few asked questions about compost or planting zones. No one asked about Brian or Karen or the past. We weren't erasing what happened. We were building over it, like people do with old scars. That night, as I sat back on my porch, a letter came in via email. It was from a man in another state, a stranger who'd heard about the story on the news. "I wanted you to know you gave me courage. Our HOA has been a nightmare for years. I thought it was just how things worked. But now I know better. I showed your story to my neighbors. We're organizing our first community forum next month. Thank you for showing us it's possible. I read it 3 times. Then I typed a simple reply. It wasn't just me, it was all of us. Keep going. I stayed on the porch long after the stars came out. The mug in my hands had gone cold. My bones ached, a little more than they used to, but my heart felt light. Peace, real peace, is a strange thing. You expect it to be loud trumpets, banners, announcements. But more often, it sounds like this: the whistle of wind through bare trees, a porch swing creaking in rhythm, the quiet clink of a coffee mug being set down, and the feeling deep in your chest that you did what you could with the time you had, that you protected something worth keeping, that you stood when it counted, and that finally, no one's knocking anymore.